Hello, YMO students. Welcome to this short video describing sonata form. Sonata form is a type of compositional style or like format that a lot of classical and romantic music composers use, like Beethoven and Mozart, Brahms, Mendelssohn. Most symphonists, most people who wrote symphonies, Haydn, Mozart, for example, they would use this type of form. And though you don't have to know the form of a symphony in order to enjoy it, it becomes so much more alive when you do know the form and you can identify the parts. Sonata form, in a big scope, is three parts: exposition, development, and recapitulation. The exposition is often played 2 times. The sonata form actually comes from the classical music thinking. So classical period in music is like, like the middle of the 1700s to the early 1800s, like maybe 1750 to like 1830, or around the death of Ludwig van Beethoven. So when we're talking about the classical period in music, we're talking about like 1750 to 1830-ish. A lot of people think that classical music is anything an orchestra plays, but the reality is the classical zone is very short. There's this idea of Freemasons and Freemasonry thinking where light defeats dark, and that there is like beauty in form and beauty in like the science of rules. So order and science are important in this time, which makes sense that sonata form would kind of take this over. So when we're talking about sonata form in big picture speak, it starts with what we call the first tonal area, music that is in a particular key. That music transitions to a second key or a second tonal area, and then the exposition kind of closes out in that key. The music then goes down into what we call development, where the music takes a little bit of what happened in the first tonal area and the second tonal area and moshes it up and like changes keys and doesn't really have a really long-standing melody. It gets really stormy and tumultuous. Then finally it retransitions into the first tonal area again. So this music from this first tonal area comes back here. Notice though it's a slightly different color though, because the first tonal area, when we first heard it, when we first heard those notes, we felt a certain way. But after being listeners, after having gone through all of this music and the very stormy and tumultuous development, the first tonal area means something different to us. The music will transition into something called the second tonal area, in quotes though, because actually it winds up being usually the same key as the first tonal area, which is the huge surprise in classical music. And we'll take an example of this. The Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. When you first hear it, very solidly in C minor, very much in C minor. This is what that first tonal area will sound like. Very much C minor. Well, then what? I guess it's happening again. Then what happens to it is the music will transition to a new key called E flat major. So instead of, we have this new key, E flat major, and the music sounds very different, and there's usually a different melody. C minor and E flat major are actually really easy keys to switch between for a composer because they have the same flats in a key signature. C minor has those 3 flats. It's got B flat in it, E flat, and A flat. That's a C minor scale, a natural minor scale. The E flat major scale has the same 3 flats. So we call these relative majors or relative minors because C minor and E major have the same key signature. E flat major. So listen to what that sounds like when we hear it in the Beethoven. Here's the transition material. Here's the second tonal. So before those woodwinds took over, the music was really tumultuous and really stormy and really rhythmic. That's really typical of a transition or transition material. The composer is going to throw a lot of notes at us, the listener, and then eventually a really beautiful second tonal area happens. So what happens then is from the second tonal area, we go to a closing section and sometimes a coda or a codetta. So we first hear the first tonal area with the transition, and then that second tonal area. The rest of the music is in the same key, that E flat major as the second tonal area. So sometimes, students, what happens is the conductor will go back to the beginning of the symphony. So we get back to the original key, which was C minor. But in this case, we now go immediately to the development. And the development takes a little bit of motives. Maybe it's that theme or another theme or a fragment of a theme from earlier in the piece, and it works it all over the place. And it's going to sound kind of stormy and modulating and changing. And then eventually we get a retransition and we hear that first tonal area again. Here's what the development sounds like, or at least part of it. So I think you can kind of hear, students, that development uses part of the beginning of the symphony, but it adds it and it creates it in a new way, so that we, the listener, feel really different when we get back to the first tonal area. And remember, this is the first tonal area that we hear after the development. So it's kind of like when we start at our home, and then we go out into the world, and something happens to us at school, or at work, or at our church or synagogue or temple or mosque, or when we go to a park, or we go to the store and something good or bad happens to us, we come back slightly changed, right? Maybe you go to the store and someone offers to pay for the thing that you're buying. Or maybe you go to the store and something bad happens to you, or you hurt yourself, or you fall or something. When you come back, you feel different, right? Well, the same thing happens in this. We have just survived the music of the development when you listen to the whole thing. So even though we're kind of back to it doesn't quite feel the same to us. Now, to be fair, Beethoven changes up the orchestration, meaning that he has slightly different instruments. Like there's some string pizzicato, and it's a little bit more gentle. So he changes the first tonal area just a tiny bit, but it's still the same theme. It's still, and that's still the same. That hasn't changed. Yet we feel differently, right? At the beginning of this, we then transitioned to that E flat. So we needed a transition. Well, Beethoven does something really exciting. And back in the day, when classical music was the popular music, when orchestras would go not to the the E flat, but to C major instead, it was a big deal. And that's why I put second tonal area with a little bit of a blue triangle to remind us of the earlier second tonal areas. Because instead of going like this, Beethoven just changes one note to C major. He takes the E flat out of the chord, changes it to an E natural, and then all of a sudden, instead of, we expect E flat, but we get C major. This is exciting stuff, everybody. It's in C major, not E flat. Is your mind exploding yet? That's what's so amazing about classical music, is that we know that the surprise is coming, but we're still surprised anyway. So again, instead of it going from to E flat, it goes to C major. And that wowed audiences. Wowed audiences. So to review the end of a sonata form first movement of a symphony, we go from the first tonal area, which is a little changed, a transition, which isn't really a transition because we're not going to E flat. We're going C minor into C major. And then it closes in that key. It closes in the home key. Actually, Beethoven, instead of keeping it in C major, he chooses to add the E flat back in at the very end to go back to E flat sounding, or sorry, C minor sounding. So that's the big picture. Sonata form was used by a lot of classical music composers to in their first movement. Mozart's, many of Mozart's symphonies, you can hear this. Mozart, Schumann, Schubert, Haydn, Beethoven, Brahms, Mendelssohn. Most classical music composers, even romantic music composers, used this form. Whether or not they intended to use this form exactly, we're not sure, but it's definitely like an unwritten rule that so many composers used. Now, you might notice that some symphonies are easier to find these parts than others, and some are a little bit difficult, but there is sort of a formula to do this. The first tonal area when you're listening to a piece of music is usually the first melody. Then there's transitional material, like stormy, rhythmically busy, and it's not melodic. Like you can't really sing it that well, or you don't remember the melody as much. The second tonal area begins with a new melody and a new key. For example, in the Beethoven that we just listened to, the new key is E flat. Do, that's a new do that we could sing. It's a new home note. The development uses small bits and pieces of the earlier themes. It cycles through a lot of keys, and again, it's really busy. It's like transition material, but it's long. Then the recap, which is short for recapitulation, which is where we get that word. Then the recap brings us back to the first tonal area. It's nearly identical, but it's not quite identical. That transition material, remember, is not really a transition. It just brings us back to, well, it doesn't bring us back anywhere. In the Beethoven, instead of going to E flat, it goes to C major, which we didn't expect. Lastly, the second tonal area, that's that big surprise, everybody. So what I want you to do is when you're spending some time listening to some music, particularly Mozart's Symphony 40 or Symphony 41, Beethoven Symphony 5, Beethoven Symphony 6, Beethoven Symphony 3, and even 7, these are really easy symphonies to kind of hear these parts. And I'm curious, if you're not sure where to label all the parts in your head, when you listen to a symphony, the first movement of a symphony by Beethoven or by Brahms or by Mendelssohn or by Schubert or Schumann, I'm curious, do you notice a difference between the first tonal area, the second tonal area, and some of the other sections? Let me know when I see you again. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.